thank you all for coming out today. Alright, remember with me, if you will, that last moment that you were working on a paper and before you were able to save it, the power goes out. And you spent hours working on this paper for nothing. All your investment in vain. And you ended up going there and just hours of your life wasted. Alright? Recall the emotion of that. Think about that for a little bit. And just think, let that kind of make an emotional feel for you guys, an aura for you guys. I believe a nation that goes in the direction of its universities. If you take the example of Yale and Harvard that were once Christian universities, but are now becoming havens for atheistic thinking, we can see that the American nation is also going the same way. So I believe that it's very important that the students of universities have in mind and are convinced of their mission so that America can continue to be a force of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness around the world. I really want you guys to understand with me the importance of this topic and how ISIS presents a current and active threat to the American public at large. ISIS is an upstart group in Iraq and Syria that stands for it's a group there in ISIS in Syria that is working. It's Islamic State of Iraq and Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or Islamic State of Iraq and the Greater Levant. It's a terrorist organization, and it is trying to establish an Islamic caliphate. Now, I'd like to present to you three arguments for why the United States should engage actively and militarily in this conflict with ISIS and engage them with a forceful nature. Number one, ISIS presents a current threat to the American people, both at home and abroad. Number two, current actions being taken by the United States government are insufficient for countering this threat. And number three, we've committed ourselves to whatever actions necessary to ensure that radical Islam does not take a foothold in these countries of Iraq and Syria. Now, ISIS, number one, ISIS presents a direct threat. Ryan Morrow, he is a security advisor, said this: Al-Qaeda and ISIS are in a competition in hitting the U.S., preferably in the homeland. Hitting the U.S. dramatically is key to winning. ISIS will be recognizable as having eclipsed Al-Qaeda if it can strike inside the U.S. The Judicial Watchdog, a group that is working to watch the government, says Islamic terrorists are operating in the Mexican border city of Ciudad Juarez and planning to attack the United States with car bombs and other vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices. And this just shows how active and how current this threat is towards the United States. Now, the United States must up its game because the current measures being taken against ISIS are not sufficient for containing this threat. We are currently engaged in airstrikes. However, these airstrikes are not enough. In an Associated Press article on Fox News, this is what was said: airstrikes alone would likely do little to truly defeat the Islamic State if there is no force on the ground to seize territory as the radicals retreat. If it launches airstrikes against the group in Syria, the U.S. runs the risk of unintentionally strengthening the hand of President Bashar Assad. So we have a problem here. We want to do something, but airstrikes aren't enough, and airstrikes in Syria could be a problem for invoking that problem there, but it's already, it's just aggravating the issue with Syria. Now, that means we obviously have to do something more. Also, the current strategy of withdrawing our troops from Iraq is jeopardizing our entire campaign. Tim Lister, a writer with CNN, said this: the capability of those Iraqi forces was fatally compromised by a lack of professional soldiers. Speaking of when the United States withdrew from Iraq, was fatally compromised by a lack of professional soldiers, a division of military units along sectarian lines, and a lack of equipment needed for fighting an insurgency, such as attack helicopters and reconnaissance capabilities. Indeed, former President Bush said something almost prophetic in a speech in 2007, saying this: to begin withdrawing from Iraq before our commanders tell us we are ready would be dangerous for Iraq, for the region, and for the United States. It'd mean that we'd be risking mass killings on a horrific scale. It'd mean we'd be allowing the terrorists to establish a safe haven in Iraq to replace the one they lost in Afghanistan. It'd mean we'd be increasing the probability that American troops would have to return at some later date to confront an enemy that is even more dangerous. Now, how exactly does that line up right now with what is happening with ISIS? We've withdrawn, and troops, terrorists that have come from Afghanistan, Syria, and that area are now starting to resurge in Iraq, Syria, and grow into this group that is even more dangerous than the one we just ousted. And just like President Bush said, we are having to come back afterwards and to confront this issue. Now, the current situation with ISIS really is a result of indecisiveness. In that same Associated Press article, Fox News reported this: the Syrian opposition and many Syrian observers are convinced that the rapid rise of the Islamic State is a result of the U.S. having left the Syrian conflict fester for so long. And if you think about it, that's really what's happening, is we haven't done much, we don't know what we're doing, and so it's just getting worse, the problem. Colonel Derek Harvey, a former senior advisor to General David Petraeus in Iraq, said that the key to defeating Islamic State or ISIS requires, here's what he said, severing the link between Raqqa, Mosul, and Tikrit. These are areas that the group ISIS has really taken and made into its powerhouses. You must cut off their communications and supply lines. This will put great stress on ISIS. So here he's saying we have to do something. We can't just bomb things. We have to go in and we have to invoke some sort of strategy and be decisive. Know what we're going to do. Let's go do it. That's in contrast with what we are currently doing, which is we don't really know. President Obama actually said we have no strategy for ISIS and that they're going to try and work on one, and hopefully by this coming Tuesday we'll be ready. President Obama said in a NATO address, part of the problem is that we haven't seen as effective a fighting force on the part of the Iraqi security forces as we need. And we're going to have to bolster their focus on the capable units that were already there. Bolster them, bolster the work that Peshmerga has done. We can support them from the air, but ultimately we're going to need a strong ground game. And it's interesting that they say we need a strong ground game because that's exactly what he said in other speeches we're not going to do. He says, I'm not going to let troops go back. But here he says that's exactly what we need. Now, we have a duty to defend our interests. That's true. We've involved ourselves for better or worse in this situation. Now, President Obama has promised aid to the Iraqi nation. He has said, my team is working effectively around the clock to identify how we can provide the most effective assistance to the Iraqis. I don't rule out anything, because we do have a stake in making sure that these jihadists are not getting a permanent foothold in either Syria or Iraq. Now, that's odd because he seems so dedicated on one side, but on the other side he doesn't really have a plan, we have no strategy. But like I've said, we need boots on the ground, we need to move into Iraq, and we need to actually do something and be decisive, and we can't just depend on airstrikes and limited reconnaissance. That won't help the situation. The desire is held by all to end well. President Obama, again, he said, in just 4 months, this was in August, we will complete our combat mission in Afghanistan, and America's longest war will come to a responsible end. Now that term responsible end is something that the end result is something that we are all proud of. It's something that comes to a good closure. But if we leave Iraq and we're worse off there than we were before, and we still have the threat of an attack on American homeland, just like we did before, is that really a responsible end? Winston Churchill, although he said he dealt with a situation slightly different, it was World War II, and his nation was facing a different crisis. He did have some principles that are applicable for us today. He said in a speech, let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. Let that also be said of us. Now, in summary, we do need to go in and we need to have an effective fighting force. We need to go in and do something more than just airstrikes. We need to decide what we're going to do. It must be a decisive effort. And we must all be committed to an end that is a responsible end. And I really would like us all as a university to get involved. I think it's important.